The topic of this lecture is what makes Islam relevant today. In this lecture, our focus is on this question: what makes Islam relevant today, particularly in a Western context? We will cover a number of issues related to this question in this lecture very briefly, such as the factors that led to a strong interest in the study of Islam and Muslims over the last 50 years or so in the West. We will look at factors such as the oil boom in the 1970s, the Iranian Revolution, the Gulf War, as well as cultural diversity in Western societies and Muslim presence and security concerns and terrorism. We will also look at Islam in a global context, the growth of Muslim population, and the unity and diversity in Muslim societies briefly. Finally, we will look at a number of approaches to the study of Islam, from Middle Eastern studies to Orientalism and the like. Hopefully, this lecture will be an introduction to the rest of the lectures in this subject. Let us look at the interest in Islam in the West, Europe in particular, in earlier times, briefly. Interest in Islam and Muslims in the West existed for many centuries. By the term West, in this context, I mean primarily Europe before the modern period. Of course, when we use the term West today, it covers a lot more than Europe. It includes North America as well as Australia. In a number of European universities, interest in Arabic and Islam existed for many centuries. But then it was more in the context of competition between Islam and Christianity. The motive often was religious. In those times, before the modern period, the interest was more about finding ways to discredit Islam and to show the superiority of Christianity. A lot of focus was on the theological issues. Islam and Christianity at the time were in competition with each other. In this lecture, we are more interested in the recent past and the present. So we will look at the last 3 to 5 decades or 50 years or so very briefly. Let us now focus on the reasons for the renewed interest in Islam in Western countries over the last few decades. The question is, why is this the case? Let me mention a few reasons. Let us look at the geopolitical factors. I think one major reason for this interest is geopolitical, related to the oil boom of the 1970s and 80s. As you might be aware, during the early part of the 20th century, large oil reserves were discovered in the Middle East in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. As other oil reserves elsewhere began to diminish in the 1970s, Western countries began to increasingly look to the Middle East for what they needed, to places like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and so on. So various trade negotiations and agreements took place around this, which motivated a focus on Middle Eastern societies and on Islam and Muslims as a result. Before oil, Middle Eastern countries were not really seen as huge players on the world stage, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were thought of as underdeveloped, with weak or struggling economies. So, on the global stage, they held relatively little interest to many Western states. That, of course, changed in the context of the oil boom. Other geopolitical events have most likely also contributed. For example, the various conflicts that have taken place in the Middle East in recent decades. They have captured the attention of the Western world. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Gulf War, and, of course, the war in Iraq have all drawn a lot of interest from Western political analysts and commentators and policymakers. So again, these larger political events have created a renewed interest in Islam and Muslim societies. Let us now look at the issue of growing cultural diversity in Western societies. Another reason for the interest in Islam and Muslims is related to the increased presence of people from other cultures and religious backgrounds in Western societies. This includes, of course, Muslims. If we take Europe as an example, in 2010 there were approximately 19.5 million Muslims living in Europe. That number rose to 25.8 million in 2016. Some projections say that the number could again double by 2050 due to both global migration and population increases among European-born Muslims. The same trend can be seen in Australia. If we look back to 2001, there were approximately 200,000 Muslims living in Australia at the time. In 2005, that number had increased to around 340,000. In 2016, there were approximately 600,000 Muslims in Australia. This increase has come from both international migration and from natural population growth. While the numbers are still small relative to the general population, they still mean an increased presence of Muslims in Australian society. So we can say that the increased presence of Muslims in Western societies has given more reason for the study of Islam and led to the desire on the part of many people in the West to know more about Muslims. Some of this has been driven by positive forces, like trying to understand Islam and Muslims as part of our broader understanding of cultural and religious diversity and the needs and contributions of specific communities. Some of this interest is negative, driven by a fear of the religion of Islam or of Muslims, who are considered often different or other to broader mainstream Western society. Let us now look at the security issues, in particular terrorism. Perhaps one of the most important factors for the renewed interest in Islam and Muslims in the West is the terrorist attacks that have taken place in Western countries in particular, and more generally around the world over the last few decades. Obviously, the events of September 11, 2001, that is, the attacks on New York and Washington, were a major contributor to this. This attack, along with those that occurred subsequently in the UK and Spain, as well as in Indonesia, in Bali, which of course impacted Australia significantly, have drawn scholars and students to study Muslim societies and Islam as a way of understanding these events. It is part of the larger concern about terrorism and security in Western societies. So we can definitely see an increased interest in the study of Islam, particularly in the last 2 decades, that is, of the 21st century, in response to these events. However, in this context, Islam is often perceived as a problem, often as a security problem. Islam is seen as a problematic religion. It is viewed as unaccommodating or at odds with Western values or modern life. So, this has driven the need to study it and understand it so it can be dealt with, or shall we say, managed in Western societies. Perhaps we should take note of an important issue, that is, interest in the study of Islam and Muslims today does not just come from non Muslim policymakers, academics, or students in the West. There has always been a very strong interest among Muslims themselves around the world in understanding the Islamic tradition, the Islamic scholarship, from Quranic studies to Hadith to Islamic law to Islamic theology and philosophy, as well as ethics to Arabic language and literature. Hundreds of thousands of Islamic institutions, that is, educational institutions at different levels of education, function in both Muslim majority and Muslim minority contexts. There are millions of students studying Islamic disciplines in these institutions. In addition to this interest in Islamic disciplines as part of their religious knowledge or acquiring religious knowledge, today there are many Muslims from various academic and non academic backgrounds who are also interested in the kinds of issues academics and policymakers in the West are interested in relation to Islam. Some of this interest has emerged to counter the negative focus on Islam and Muslims. Yet there are many Muslims who want to be involved in debates and discussions about the place of Islam in the modern world and how to reconcile traditional Islamic thought with uh, modernization and modernity, for instance. So, again, this has contributed to the renewed interest in the study of Islam. Let us now look at Islam in a global context. According to most recent estimates, there are about 1.8 billion Muslims around the world, which equates to roughly 24% of the global population. Islam is not the largest religious tradition worldwide. Christianity still has the largest number of followers. There are more than 2 billion Christians globally. However, Islam appears to be the world's fastest growing religious tradition. According to Pew Research, if trends continue as they are, Islam will become the largest religious tradition in the world by the end of this century. The question is, why is this the case? Perhaps the main reason for Islam's growth is demographics. Muslim population in a number of what many refer to as developing countries is increasing significantly compared to many other countries where Islam is not the majority religion. This does not mean that all Muslim majority countries have high birth rates. Some countries have and others don't. So there is no uniform picture when it comes to birth rates in Muslim majority countries. High birth rates can be associated with a whole range of factors, and religion could be just one of them. In many Muslim societies, the population is also relatively young, which means there are more Muslims at childbearing age compared to many other societies. Where do most Muslims live? There is a common perception that most Muslims generally live in what we call the Middle East, in places like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Gulf states, and so on. This is not actually the case. Only about roughly 20% of the world's Muslims live in the Middle East and North Africa. The largest number of Muslims around the world, that is 62%, can actually be found in the Asia Pacific region. So you can see here another strategic reason for Australia's interest in the study of Islam and Muslim societies, given its proximity to the region. The country with the world's largest Muslim population is actually Indonesia. There are approximately 225 million Muslims living in Indonesia. However, in the next 30 years or so, Indonesia is likely to be overtaken by India, which is projected to be the largest Muslim population by 2050. What this means is the largest Muslim community or society will be a minority living in the Hindu majority state, that is India. As I have already mentioned, Islam is a growing religious tradition. The number of Muslims living in places like Europe, North America, and Australia are likely to grow significantly in the coming years. So, this is another reason why the study of Islam and of Muslim communities remains so important. It will continue to be relevant either at the level of regional relations or at the community level in terms of the lived reality of cultural and religious diversity in our societies. So, what are some of the issues related to the study of Islam and Muslims that are increasingly important in today's context, particularly in the West? Well, Islam's engagement with modernity, modern ideas, modern values, and institutions and systems is going to continue to be important. Islam is a religious tradition with a long history. Traditionally received ideas, values, and ways of doing things remain influential in the way many Muslims think and in the way their beliefs are lived out. But not all of these are considered perhaps compatible with some dominant modern ideas, values, and institutions. The world has changed significantly since Islam emerged, but particularly over the last 200 years. Human rights, artificial intelligence, climate change, nuclear weapons, the decline of traditional marriage relationships, democracy, secularism, the internet, social media. These are just a few changes or examples of change that are part and parcel of modern life now. For Muslims and for Islamic scholars, the ulama, which is an Arabic word, and Muslim thinkers, there is going to be continued need for negotiation between traditionally received beliefs, values, and laws on the one hand, and the norms, values, and practices of the contemporary world on the other. We might see this kind of conflict or renegotiation in debates about, for example, the wearing of the veil, or in Arabic, hijab, Hijab, or about human rights, or about if and how Sharia law, or in other words, Islamic law, should be applied in the West today, in Western countries today. We should be careful not to label all Muslims as adopting one set of beliefs and values. Muslims are very diverse. They are like any other religious community. In any religious community, it is always easy to find those who are more interested in maintaining the tradition and the received wisdom from the past, and those who are interested in adapting those ideas to changing contexts and circumstances, and those who are in between. More importantly, Islam as a religious tradition has always maintained within it a wide range of voices, schools of thought, and interpretations of law, ethics, and theology. So, Islam as a religion and Muslims have for the last 1400 years have by and large remained open to different ideas, different ways of doing things, different interpretations, and the like. The modern period is no different. Another important issue is engagement with cultural and religious diversity, particularly in the West. Our societies are becoming increasingly diverse in many respects. So the challenge is going to be how to live closely or amongst people who are different in many respects to us. Muslims have migrated in large numbers to Western countries from predominantly Muslim majority countries. In addition to that, there are millions of Muslims living in Western countries who have been there for generations. Of course, there are also converts to Islam from other religions. For thinkers and policymakers, the challenge is going to be how to accommodate an increasing number of Muslims or increasing numbers of Muslims in Western societies. It's going to mean addressing, among other things, like discrimination where that exists. It's going to mean ensuring the needs of Muslim communities, for example, are met in terms of education or aged care or in terms of places of worship. For Muslims themselves, it will mean dealing with issues such as working out how to engage with non-Muslims, and about whether to renegotiate certain norms and values from the Islamic tradition that perhaps may not be conducive to harmonious relationships in religiously diverse societies. Let us now look at the issue of unity and diversity of Muslim communities in the West. Perhaps let us focus on Australia as an example. According to our last census, there were about 600,000 Muslim Australians, which equates to approximately 2.6% of the Australian population. So, what are Muslim Australians like, or Australian Muslims like? Well, I think the first thing to say is that they are not a homogeneous group. They are very diverse, much like any other segment of Australian society. Muslim Australians come from many different cultural backgrounds. They come from Lebanon, Turkey, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Pakistan, Indonesia, Iraq, Somalia, Bangladesh, Iran, and Fiji, just to name a few countries. In fact, from over 150 different countries. So while they share the central tenets of the Islamic faith, there is also great diversity in how they practice Islam from the different cultural and linguistic backgrounds they have come from. Another element of diversity is the extent to which they practice their faith. Like in other parts of the world, there are different levels of adherence or piety among Muslims. Some Muslims are very devout and practice most, if not all, of their religious requirements, like praying 5 times a day, fasting in the month of Ramadan, paying the obligatory zakat, for example. On the other hand, there are Muslims who may adopt an Islamic religious identity, but who do not practice any religious obligations. And of course, there are those who are in between. In Australia, there are both Sunni and Shia Muslims. Approximately 70 to 80% of Australian Muslims are Sunni, and 20 to 30% would be Shia. Internally, both Sunnis and Shia are diverse. Some Muslim Australians are what we call Sufis and follow different Sufi paths or mystical paths. Some could be referred to as Islamists, which means they are very interested in ideas about how Islam should influence the political sphere and about Islamic forms of governance. Others, Salafis, Salafis, which means they belong to a trend of Islamic thought that quite strictly attempt to follow the traditions of Prophet Muhammad and his immediate followers, known as the companions, and the earliest generations of Muslims. There are others who are referred to as modernists, traditionalists, and a whole lot of other labels. Probably the vast majority of Muslims do not necessarily label themselves as Islamist, modernist, traditionalist, Salafi, Sufi, or any other. They simply refer to themselves as Muslims. In addition to this, many Muslims do not see any particular problems in living and functioning in a predominantly non Muslim context, while other Muslims see this as a serious issue. Some Muslims are more comfortable with the secular laws, systems, and institutions we have in Australia. Others see these as a threat to their religious identity. Then, of course, there is the issue of first generation Muslims who come from somewhere else, and second and third and fourth generation Muslims who were born here. There are also converts to Islam from other religious traditions. Of course, there are also significant divisions among Muslims on ethnic lines. This means there is quite a bit of diversity in how Muslims approach different issues and the influences they draw from. This is also true of Muslims around the world in general. This diversity in thinking and approaches and influences can be found in Muslim societies around the world, both in Muslim majority countries and, of course, in the West. Does this mean then there is nothing that unifies these very diverse Muslim communities or societies or Muslims? I would say there are a number of things that bring these Muslims under one umbrella. There are a number of core beliefs and practices that Muslims by and large adhere to wherever they are. For example, Muslims in general, wherever they are, believe in a number of things, such as belief in one God or Allah, belief in prophets and Prophet Muhammad, belief in holy scriptures or revelations from God, life after death and accountability, and so forth. There are also practices Muslims in general consider to be extremely important and fundamental. For example, the five daily prayers or Salat, S-A-L-A-T, of fasting in the month of Ramadan, paying a percentage of their annual savings to the poor, the needy, and disadvantaged, and community needs. And of course, performing the pilgrimage to Mecca once in one's lifetime. There are also ethical and moral values Muslims are expected to abide by, such as honesty, telling truth, and in general, doing what is right, helping the disadvantaged, and taking care of the neighbor, and looking after one's parents in their old age. So, in short, there are certain things that Muslims around the world are quite comfortable with as being part of their understanding of Islam. But beyond that, there may be many differences among them. We will look more closely at what these are in coming lectures. What that means for us is when we say Muslims believe this or Muslims do this, we need to recognize that by making such a generalization, it may not reflect the reality of very many Muslims today. Let us now look at some of the approaches to the study of Islam and Muslims. The question is, how is the study of Islam and Muslims approached in the West? Given that we are based in a Western country and at a Western university, we are focusing on the Western context. For our purposes, we are not really interested in the study of Islam in Europe before the 19th century in this lecture. Our focus is more on the 19th and 20th centuries, and we are including this interest not just in Europe but also in other Western countries. First, let us look at Orientalism briefly. A key approach to the study of Islam and Muslims in the West is what we may refer to as Orientalism or Orientalist approach. This is a school or trend of thought that existed in the 19th century in the West and continued, of course. One could argue that Orientalism existed in the West well before the 19th century. Our interest is in this idea, not so much about when it started. Orientalism was interested in studying places that were perceived to be far away or exotic to Westerners or Europeans. In this framework, non Westerners, including Muslims, were basically perceived as the other and became an interesting topic of study for that reason. Another focus of Orientalism was reviving past knowledge from classical civilizations. So, in this context, the translation of Arabic texts was a major project of Orientalists. There are criticisms of the Orientalist approach to the study of Islam and Muslim societies. One of the most well known works in this regard was written by Edward Said, an Arab American literary critic. His view was that Europe had constructed this fictional idea of the Orient as a way of either romanticizing or deliberately drawing attention away from its colonial activities in many Muslim countries or Arab Muslim countries. So there is in this criticism that Orientalism as an approach basically supports Western political, economic, and intellectual dominance, influence, and power over the Muslim world. It doesn't see Muslim societies or cultures as worthy of study in their own right, according to Edward Said. Let's look at the Middle Eastern studies approach briefly. One of the assumptions of the early approaches to Middle Eastern studies was that, from a Western point of view, the Middle East was seen as a bit of a backward place. It was seen as a place that lacked enlightenment in terms of modern advances in thinking or exposure to Enlightenment ideals. So it was studied, but only as a point of reference to distinguish it from other societies, namely the Western ones. Of course, there are other considerations. In terms of Middle Eastern studies being a lens to study Islam and Muslims, there are certainly some shortcomings of this approach. As we have discussed, Islam can be found in other places around the world. That has been the case for a long time. So, to limit our focus of study of Islam and Muslims to only the Middle East is to disregard a good deal of the richness and diversity that can be found in other Muslim societies. It is probably also too simplistic to assume that the Middle East is synonymous with Islam because there are many other long established religious traditions in the Middle East. A more recent limitation to studying Islam through Middle Eastern studies is that it tends to be studied through the framework of geopolitical issues like the Arab Israeli conflict, or terrorism, or security threats. So, again, this is quite a limited frame of reference for the study of Islam and Muslims. Let us look at the Islamic studies approach. Islamic studies is another approach that has emerged relatively recently, but it actually has a longer history, first emerging in response to the colonial period. This approach is quite evident in university settings today, with the creation of specific Islamic studies departments or research centers. The Islamic studies approach tends to focus on areas such as Islamic law. Of course, there are other areas. It studies both Islam's traditional, legal, intellectual history as well as contemporary debates among Muslim intellectuals. Another approach to the study of Islam and Muslims comes from those interested in gender studies or feminism. This approach emerged in the 1970s, and it focuses on Islamic norms about women and how they can be reconciled with contemporary norms and values like non discrimination and equality for women. So, what is the future for the study of Islam and Muslim societies? There are scholars in the field who argue that there is still a long way to go before the study of Islam and Muslims or Muslim societies is fully integrated into Western academic and cultural research, teaching and research. There is still a tendency for these areas to be confined within Asian studies, Near Eastern studies, or Middle Eastern studies departments, that is, Islamic studies being confined to Asian studies, or Near Eastern studies, or Middle Eastern studies, where Islam and Muslims are studied rather narrowly within those specific lenses. The study of Islam generally lacks engagement with other departments or academic disciplines. For example, with those working in fields such as history, psychology, sociology, and philosophy. There are also questions about whether Islam should be studied in isolation from the study of Judaism or Christianity, especially given that they share theological and scriptural origins. Another challenge for the study of Islam and Muslim societies in the West is that it is often difficult to collaborate with institutions or scholars in Muslim majority countries. The lack of intellectual freedom in many Muslim majority countries makes it somewhat difficult for the scholars in the West to carry out empirical or scientific studies that might create new knowledge or add to our understanding of these societies. So, a significant body of the scholarship about the Muslim world takes the form of narrative or descriptive studies rather than data based scientific studies. Of course, that happens, but it's a question of how much. Finally, let me mention some of the key resources we may need to draw upon for the study of Islam and Muslim societies. An important source is the Holy Quran, which is Islam's most important sacred text. The source is the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, or Hadith, which gives us insights into Prophet Muhammad's practice and, of course, his sayings and deeds. There are also historical and biographical texts that can shed light on what the context of the first Muslim community was like, which will be helpful for understanding the context of the beginning of Islam and the revelation of the Quran. So, in summary, in this lecture, we have tried to present a brief overview of why Islam matters today, particularly for a Western audience. We looked at the reasons for this interest in the study of Islam and Muslims in the West, from geopolitical factors to cultural diversity in Western societies to security and terrorism issues. We also looked at Islam in a global context, the unity and diversity of Muslim societies, and a number of ways of approaching the study of Islam and Muslims. Thanks for watching. We hope this deepened your understanding of Islam. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Keep exploring. Don't forget to subscribe.